Thank you, Lance. Kind introduction. First, I want to thank Lance for putting on such an amazing event. I mean, obviously, the turnout is unbelievable. It grows every year. This is like the one time during the year we have this and the ABCA where we can go to share information and gain knowledge and get around like-minded people, because for the most part, the rest of the year, we're all on an island, right? And half the time, you don't know, you're testing stuff out, trying stuff. So, thank Lance, thank my family. And I have Dr. Emily Ferree with me as well. So we have 2 facilities located in Southern California. Anybody that has one facility, don't open up a second one, right? Because you're going to have to work ridiculously hard. It's very, very tough between both shops. So 2, we started a partnership with the biomechanics lab about 2 years ago. And in the last year, we've had the opportunity to test things at a considerably higher degree. We've been able to send a lot of players through there to continue to work together on gaining a better understanding of what we're actually seeing, what we're actually doing, testing results, and trying to understand more about how the body moves in relation to hitting and throwing. I would say that we are data influenced, but results driven, right? So hopefully you'll get an understanding of that through the rest of the presentation. And we also have a unique cross-section of clients, right? So we had an 11-year-old that came in for an evaluation about 2 months ago. He was 78 to 80 off the mound and topped out at 81. He's 11, right? We're in Southern California. We see unbelievable players. We got the opportunity to work with maybe 14 or 15 kids on the USA team at different age brackets this last year. We work with, elite high school players, college players, big leaguers, and see them on a fairly regular basis. So we get to test a lot of things out. And, if you have a team, you get the opportunity to work with 15 guys over the course of the year. We have the opportunity to see 100 guys on both sides of the ball every 2 weeks. So we get to see things, I think, at a little bit of a different degree. So there's a quote by a guy named Serge Grakovetsky, who's brilliant. If you don't know his work, look into him. And he says, "Physics is wonderful because you know that whatever you do, someone else will show you that you're wrong. So now that you know that everything I will tell you is wrong, there is no point to disagree with me." So look, some of the stuff in the presentation, this is going to challenge some of the thinking that we've had in the past, which I think is a very important thing to move forward. So here's a quote from John Ioannidis from Stanford University. "It can be proven that most claimed research findings are false." Think about GERD, right? Guys hurt their arms, and then all of a sudden, we test them, and a doctor says, "Oh, well, this arm can go down to here, this one can only go down to here." And then we come to find out later that that's just a natural adaptation of the human body to gain external rotation in the throw, right? So there's no correlation between that and the actual injury. So next one, lowering the mound. I know Kyle looked into this a while back. We did the same thing. We had an elite high school baseball player that's 16 that was up to 96 throw pitches off the mound and flat. Off the mound, he had less than 20 Newton meters of torque. Less than 20. On flat, he was 105. He didn't have the time to get his arm up and get it to turn and capture at the right time. So there's a lot of things that have been said or we look at, but we need to continue to look at a little bit differently. So all too often, science is presented as trafficking in absolute truths. On the contrary, science is a framework for interpreting, systematizing, and predicting nature based on empirical observations. Here's the deal. Man sees apple fall from tree. Man says, "Why does apple fall from tree?" Man discovers why apple fell from tree. Baseball coaches are not by nature scientists. That's not how this thing evolved, right? So we are coaches that got results doing certain things, right? Like slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right? That's not wrong. There is nothing that is wrong. Everyone in here, there's nothing that anybody's done that's wrong. Individuals interpret information differently, and as a result, different things work. If baseball coaches were scientists, how this thing would have started was testing empirical observations. Why is it that when I tell him to swing down and him to swing up, he creates a better result with this one and he creates a better result with that one? Why is it that we didn't test, okay, well, how come when I tell this guy that's 87 to go smoother and easier, he's at 90? Right? He's trying less hard, but producing a better result. Understanding those questions is extremely important to continue to move the needle forward. Okay? So last year we did the presentation. It was predominantly on hitting. One of the things that we tested was angles of the lower half when we swing. Right? So everybody, the scissor gained a lot of popularity. Right? Being closed off is the same thing. If you look at like 90% of the greatest hitters that have ever lived, you're going to see them in one of three positions. You're going to see them angled closed, stepping closed, or kicking back. Because as human beings, we're reciprocal movers. And we tested this in the lab. We already knew it worked. We empirically observed that it worked. Like, we were telling guys to do it, and we tried it and messed with it, and guys were improving exit velocities, time to contact was better. Like, guys were getting results with it. Jose Altuve got results with it really, really fast. Miggy told him, why don't you try that? And he did. And then he does an interview and says, oh, this is where I get my power from. He feels it. He doesn't need a lab to know that he's doing it. He's producing a better result. But we went to the lab and we tested it and we got the results back. The kickback produced extremely higher force rates, like way higher in a lot of different areas. And closed off is very similar to that. So here's some of the greatest hitters who've ever lived, right? Watch their back foot. That's Hank Aaron, Ernie Banks, Mike Trout, right? Robin Yount, Stanton. He closed off and then got better, right? That's why. Watch how they're moving. Okay, so this is a professional player that we work with. He was fortunate enough to get called up to the big leagues this year. So he's throwing a medicine ball against the wall on a Cortex board, okay? Watch the degrees that his feet, that one he was able to stick. I told him to do it at 60%. That one, I told him to do it 80%. This one was 100%. The harder he tried to throw it, right, the more he spun, the more he went cross-body. You heard Lance talk a lot the other day about moving from the middle. Okay, as human beings, we need to move from the middle. Can you explain a little bit about reciprocal movement patterns?
Generally, the way our bodies are wired, there's no actual physical connection between muscles. So we talk a lot about a kinetic chain and how muscles move and work together. Muscles aren't actually connected, but muscles insert into what's called fascia, which is a connective tissue that's completely continuous throughout your body. And so up to 30% of your muscle fibers actually insert into that fascia. And so when you contract a muscle, it pulls on the connective tissue, which pulls on another muscle and creates a contractile response. So certain muscles are designed to work and contract together, and certain muscles are designed to oppose that. So basically, most all of our movement is centered around gait, which is a reciprocal motion. You think left leg forward, right arm swing. So that would be a reciprocal motion. So the way our muscles are structured and designed, even neurologically throughout our spinal cord, they're designed to contract in certain patterns that are generally always reciprocal.
Not only is that creating a better or more optimal length-tension relationship in the muscles, right? It's also stopping the hips sooner. You've heard everybody talk about, right? Like Jason was talking about in the better hitters, they decelerate better, right? They decelerate better. How about this deceleration? How about these guys just sticking baseballs? Okay, think Mike Schmidt. Here's Trout. J.D. Martinez. Look at the angle of their hips. It's closed. It's not open. Everybody's focused on the engine, when it's more about the brakes. You got to put the brakes on with the lower half so the trunk can accelerate. You got to put the brakes on with the trunk so the barrel can accelerate. All of these things can be taught. Everything is a teach and everything is a non-teach. You don't teach everybody to do the same thing, but these are ways to become more efficient with hitters. And look, we haven't gotten the opportunity to test all of these in the lab yet, but I already know what the results are going to be. Why? Because I'm not, like Ferb says, I'm not weird. Look at it, right? Like these guys are doing this because of that. When you hear A-Rod, one of the greatest, he got blown up on Twitter. Blown up on Twitter. We're talking about one of the greatest hitters that's ever lived, right? Blown up on Twitter for talking about his barrel being above his hands, right? Blown up on Twitter for talking about his lower half. He doesn't know anything. Maybe you don't know what's actually happening inside his body and you don't know what he felt. When you watch him talk about Turner and how his legs look like 1,000-year-old tree trunks screwed into the ground, watch the swing. Like if you watch his swing at the end of this, like look at that. He's stuck. He's stopped. He's creating a better impulse on the ball, like a bigger explosion by doing that. Okay, so this is a really powerful video. This is one of the greatest right-handed pitchers in the history of the game. Okay, Pedro Martinez, 5'10", 98, 20 years, never had an arm injury. So he's going to talk about one of the things he thought while he was pitching, and then he's going to talk about. I think the article was entitled Pedro Martinez on saving your pitching elbow. Okay.
Where the release point is. You said you threw it out in front of your face?
Yes, I wanted to
You try to get as far as home plate as you can.
I wanted to have an imaginary tube where I wanted to have my hand, where I kind of wanted to see it and then follow the ball, and this gets exposed and doesn't have the time to get properly on top like it should.
At no point did he throw from that slot ever once in his entire career. He had optimal movement. Was the thought for him to get over the top important? Yeah, for him. Maybe when he thought about that, he got into his lead hip better, right? But when you if he told a team of 12-year-olds that, or a team of high school kids get over the top, and he shows that, maybe they don't all create the same movement. There's a common theme everybody keeps hearing today: movement, movement, movement. Because how we move is responsible for all of the results that we produce. All the velocity in the arm, the health in the arm, everything that's happening is coming from how we move. And if we move better, right, we create better results, healthier, harder, more efficient results. Feel versus real, right? That's really important and can be super confusing. Because sometimes what a guy feels isn't really what's actually happening. But if it's helping him produce a better result, right, because he's interpreting that information well, then it's really important, right? And I also think, and obviously we don't have data behind this, but if you look at, you know how guys talk about their barrel above their hands? Like really good players have really good feel, right? So A-Rod talks about it, Trout talks about it, Pujols talks about it. Those guys are pretty good. Those guys are pretty good. So I'm pretty sure our brain perceives information like based on, like spine angle, like how you walk around every day. So if I put my barrel above my hands like this, right, you can't hit like that. But what if I tilt my trunk over, but keep my hands in the same position, right? Tilt my trunk over. So for me, I feel my barrel on top of my hands, but in reality, right, like it's below if I'm watching a video, it's below my hands. But in reality, it might not be. It is in relation to his spine angle, might be above. So this was a video of the same player that we were working with, and we were working through that feel with him. Like he's working on this offseason, like sticking balls a little bit better and staying on plane a little bit better. Or more directional, I would say, not better. And when he was doing the work in the cage, he was not creating the right movement adaptation. So my thought was, what if we try to tell him barrel above hands? I wonder what happens. He argued with me for like 15 minutes, like, great relationship. Like we talked back and forth. Finally, I got him to do it, and he created a better back path. Like the path was better. He felt better. He didn't like that was his thought because he knows that that's not what's happening, but he was better. We don't have time to play it's like a 4-minute video. We got to keep moving through because we have a lot of stuff to present. So I'm going to turn this over to the doctor because she's going to do a way better job than I am explaining the whole motor learning thing. Like we have this huge movement in the game, and like Andy McKay, I hold an event called Bridge the Gap on the West Coast, and Andy McKay spoke this year, and one of the things he talked about was that in baseball, we tend to go like way too far in given directions, right? And this whole like self-organization, external goals, like yes, like I love external goals, right? But I also love internal goals. If you guys listened to Zach DeCan earlier, you would have heard him say the same thing, right? Because everything has value and everything has merit. But there's a big movement on that, so I just wanted to turn it over to Emily so she could kind of explain some of that stuff.
So a lot of the research that guides that kind of trend in baseball right now for external cueing and whole practice and goal-based or results-based practice is driven from research that takes complex tasks and looks at how do people best learn new motor behaviors. They take people and they teach them a novel task, and then they're focusing on task retention. And so I would argue that in baseball, with the athletes that you're training, with the athletes that I'm training, and that Eugene is training, that we are not taking people and teaching them a novel task. What we're doing is we're taking elite-level athletes who have a very hardwired motor program of how to do something that is now habitual. That motor program is actually coded within the frontal cortex of your motor cortex of your brain, and it's very automatic. So the population that we're treating, that we're trying to train, that we're trying to develop skills in is not the same type of population that is in a lot of this research. They're not novel learners. These aren't novel tasks. We're working with an existing motor plan and just trying to tweak or alter like a very hardwired motor program. Unfortunately, in the research, there really isn't any research that is actually doing just that. That's taking elite level athletes and trying to not teach them a new motor program, but to give them just slight tweaks to their existing motor program. Reason for that is us scientists don't want to mess with elite athletes and tweaking their performance, because if we messed with performance, we'd be in trouble. And most elite level athletes aren't volunteering for research that would tweak their motor programs. So I would argue that potentially the research in motor learning that may be most applicable to your athletes, to elite level baseball players, and to what you're actually doing with your athletes is research in the neurologic sector on gait retraining. So walking is extremely automatic. None of you think to yourself, heel, toe, left leg, right arm swing, left arm swing. You can walk in variable environments with different shoes on at different cadences, and your gait is generally the same always. Gait and walking is actually pre-programmed in your spinal cord. So they've done research on cats and disconnected their brain to their spinal cord and stuck them on a treadmill, and they've walked. So completely brain-dead cats, no connection between their brain and their body, and they have a reflex within their spinal cord that will allow them to continue to...
Science.
Yeah, this is why science is... This was done like back in the 70s, so we were like PETA and all that wasn't a thing. Point being, gait and walking is programmed within your spinal cord, and it is habitual and automatic. And so what we do in the physical therapy world, when we want to change the way that somebody walks, we basically do the exact opposite of everything I just mentioned before. None of this whole practice, none of this big external cues, none of this task-based approaches. What the research in gait research shows us is that in order to effectively change the motor pattern of somebody's walking is that you break down a very complex movement into phases. You work physically, individually. You do part versus whole practicing. There's a lot of intrinsic tactile cueing, a lot of like explicit information on exactly how to perform that phase of movement, which generally research will say, don't ever do that. You don't want a lot of explicit information on how to do a task. You just want to implicitly learn. But it's the exact opposite with this very habitual task. What you actually want to do is give them a ton of information on how you do it. And research will show that the most effective way, what they do with gait, is they essentially put sensors all over the body, and they're visually showing the patient which muscles are contracting, when they're contracting, how they're contracting. So they're giving them all of this feedback on what's happening so that they can actually change the way that they move. And the reason that is effective is you're taking a very automatic task and making it not automatic. If a major league pitcher is not thinking about how to throw when he's on the mound, he's just throwing. You've taken a task that is automatic for him. Same thing with hitters. The ball comes and they're responding. They're not thinking about it, they're responding. So if you want to actually alter that pattern, you have to basically bypass the automaticity or the habitual effect of that movement. And the way to do that is basically the opposite of what most motor learning research is doing.
And that's what we kind of presented on last year, because that's what I feel like. Look, I like everything. I've done everything. I've gone full intent-based. I've done all of it, right? And my job is to get results. I'm influenced by data and what it tells me, but I'm not a slave to it. I'm trying to get results that last on the field, right? The kid that we showed earlier, like he hit 261 or 267, something like that last year. This year he hit 347. So something that we did worked. His OPS went up like 100 points. His slugging went up like 100 points, like that or more. But that was because of very specific alterations in his movement patterns that were created through an evaluation based on how he was moving, what was happening in games, and then putting a plan in place together to alter the motor patterns. Like when you look at what Zach was talking about earlier, that guy's brilliant, right? He's doing the exact same thing with guys in the weight room. That's why he's really good at what he does. He's focusing on movement. Okay, so Serge Grakovetsky, again, brilliant professor. The fittest of a species is often described as the one that makes the most economical use of its energy resources within its own ecological niche or ecosystem. So what that basically means is he who does the least to create the most survives the longest, right? How many guys you see, sexiest thing you could watch, guy effortlessly throw a ball 100, right? Let's watch a couple of those.
strikeout. Now he's ahead of Leon, 1-2.
So, I'm definitely playing that one. It's 101. So let's use empirical observation, guys. We got all these baseball guys in this room. If we're all watching that, we say that looks easy, right? That looks easy. But we also see that his back leg, like all of them, on their hardest pitches is not even getting past their lead leg. It's not even getting past their lead leg. We see them not really like driving and pushing early. We see them kind of like floating, like just easy down the mound, conserving energy. And then all of a sudden picking up all of this like momentum, capturing energy up the chain and decelerating the brakes. They are putting on the brakes better than everybody else. When you talk about balance, when you talk about being tall or slow as smooth as fast, that's it. That's what it looks like. Everybody that's always said that, not wrong. Not wrong. But if you tell that to one guy, he might throw really slow, and you tell it to another guy, and he throws hard. Like, it depends on how they're interpreting the movement. So this next one, I think, is try to keep an open mind here. I think if everybody looks at it like through an open lens, you're going to get it. Oh, damn it.
With a one-run lead and a
Okay, recoils. Who decided that it was bad decelerator strength? The doctor? Is that the same doctor that gives a guy that comes in with an arm issue like a trash throwing program and tells him to go work on his decel strength and he's going to be fine? And then after 3 months off, he goes back to throwing and he still feels like crap? Is it that same doctor? Like, I think so. I think so. Because when we first started, like, looking into this, I was working with a hitter last year during the off season, and we're working on trunk decel moves. And I had like a random thought, like, what if that's where the recoil comes from too? What if it's just a decel of the trunk? And then I started calling a bunch of crazy people like me. I called Wes. I think I called Lance. I called a bunch of people. And they were all like, yeah, totally could be. And then after a couple of months, like, I got the balls to try it, like to tell a kid to do it. Right? The kid was a rising junior in high school, 16 years old, never been above 85. Right? I think it was like 85.3 or something like that. And just everything leaking forward, everything kind of just folding across, kind of jumping forward. Everybody has a guy like that, you know what I'm talking about. So I just told him. I said, dude, you ever watch Severino? You ever watch how he kind of conyo finish, like pimps the finish? Yeah, right? And by the way, like, have you ever seen anybody that doesn't throw fuel that does it? Like, if we were on an island right now and we didn't have any of the information that we have, and we saw a group of guys throwing really hard over here that did it, and a group of guys that didn't over here, is the first thing we're going to think to ourselves, you know what, the back of his shoulder's probably weak. Like, probably not. Okay? So I told him to try it, and he did. And guess what? In that bullpen in 20 minutes, he jumped 4 miles an hour in peak EV, averaged 3 higher, sat 87 to 89 for the rest of the summer, and committed to a big D1 program that summer. Like, he felt better, his arm felt better, felt easier. So now I'm going to turn it over to the doctor because we tested this in the lab.
So it is my hope and goal today that you all realize that this idea of weak decelerators with an arm recoil is a total myth. So what is actually happening when an arm recoils? It's not that your decelerators have just completely stopped working for you. In fact, it's the exact opposite. So what is actually happening when an arm recoils is you have something called a muscle spindle reflex working, and your overall fascial kinetic chain is also at work. So you guys have all been to the doctor, you sat on the table, they've tapped your knee, and your leg is kicked out, correct? Unless you have something severely neurologically wrong with you. So what that reflex is, it's the same reflex that's happening when an arm recoils. So in every muscle of your body, you have a neuroreceptor called a muscle spindle. That spindle is sensitive to stretch. So what happens is your muscle is stretched as it's lengthened. That spindle registers that your muscle is stretching. It sends a neural response up to the motor pool in the spinal cord for that muscle. That motor pool then sends another motor signal a nerve response back down to that muscle to contract and shorten. So basically, it's this reflex arc where a muscle is lengthened and then contracts to shorten again. It's your body's natural protective response to keep your muscles from overstretching, which would cause tearing, things like that. And then along with that, what is happening, as I mentioned earlier with reciprocal motion, there's only one tissue in your body that is completely continuous, and it's called fascia. So if you were to skin a human, what would be underneath your skin is a continuous sheath of what's called fascia. It's this very clear connective tissue. And the fibers of that fascia, they run in certain slings and chains, and that's what I mentioned before is connecting certain muscle groups. And so you have something called a posterior oblique fascial sling. That runs from your glute max up your thoracolumbar fascia to your lat, all the way up to your posterior rotator cuff. So what happens as a pitcher follows through in his arm motion, your stride leg, your front leg glute is maximally contracting and lengthening. Your thoracolumbar fascia, your lat is lengthening, and of course your decelerators and your posterior rotator cuff are all lengthening. So in a perfectly healthy neurologic system, as those muscles all lengthen and contract together, your nerve should be firing, going up your spinal cord and contracting those muscles back to strengthen them. So an arm recoil is, in my opinion, the safest, most efficient way for your body to self-protect and at a high velocity to pull your arm back. So what we do instead is we teach baseball players to tuck their hand in their back pocket and just continue that arm motion to pull it close to their body. What happens is towards the end of that motion, your pec and the other internal rotators of your shoulder are actually concentrically pulling your arm that direction. And we have another neurologic response. It's called automatic inhibition. And so what happens is when the muscles that are opposite other muscles, so a flexor and an extensor, if a flexor contracts, my body will automatically relax my extensor in order to continue that range of motion. So if my pec is on pulling my arm back to my back pocket, my rotator cuff is going to turn off. So instead of a really strong decelerator, as I pull my arm towards my back pocket, I'm not only lengthening my rotator cuff, but I've now shut it off. So what we've seen a little bit with some EMG studies that we put on some guys is that there's actually less rotator cuff activity and more lengthening when you have them tuck their hand towards their back pocket. So in my opinion, and I know I'm not in the baseball world necessarily, I'm not coaching, but from a biomechanical standpoint, it's my opinion that an arm recoil is actually much healthier than pulling the arm to the back pocket.
So let's think about Severino, right? When you go on Baseball Savant and you type in 97 to 102, 2017, 2018, only show plays with video, you get this list of like guys who threw pitches within those velocities. Guess who's number one on the list? It's Severino. He throws 101 in the ninth inning. Like, it's because he stops so well, right? It's because he stops so well. So we actually
if you don't believe me from a theoretical standpoint, we do have data. So Eugene took a lot of his throwers on their initial eval, so he had not trained them or coached them yet. And we measured the amount of stress at their elbow and just overall kinematics and kinetics of their throwing motion. And then he brought them back in, taught them to arm recoil, so it was an accurate movement, and didn't give them any other cueing or anything like that, and just had them throw their same pitch, no other cues to change anything else but just to recoil. We measured on average a 38% decrease in torque at the elbow, different kinematic changes throughout the throwing motion that resulted in better arm patterning and better just general motions of both the upper and lower body. And then we also measured changes in overall kinetic sequencing, so timing of rotation and things like that. So here's just a couple data examples from some of our guys who had the biggest effect size with the recoil. So this is a graph of the torque at the elbow at their peak position. So both of these graphs are zoomed, not to scale, so I know they look the same, but if you look at the raw numbers, this particular athlete went from 134 newton meters of torque to 35 newton meters of torque. Like, such a drastic drop in torque with only cued to recoil.
Above 115 for reference, like 115 or above is considered not if, but when, right? Like if you're looking at like 90 to 115, high end is safe, but would like to stay, ideally below that.
So this is a picture demonstrating some of the kinematic changes that we saw in some of our pitchers. This particular athlete at stride foot contact, what you'll notice is he's leaked open, his shoulders are towards home plate, his elbow is really low, and then afterwards, Same time point, stride foot contact. His shoulders are more closed. His elbow's in a better position, and what that resulted in, it was less elevation of the shoulder and less elevation of his elbow and a lot less torque on his elbow as he pitched. And then this is a graph of the kinetic sequence of a particular athlete as well. So this is a graph of rotational velocity of the pelvis, the torso, and as the arm comes through. So pelvis is in red, torso is in green, and then arm is in blue. And what you'll see before is that this particular pitcher actually initiated rotation with his torso. His pelvis came late, and then his arm comes right after his pelvis. So his sequencing is off. With only the cue to recoil, this is his kinetic sequence afterwards, and what you see is actually proper sequencing, initiating with his hips, very closely followed by his torso, and then a slight lag with his arm.
So what I would say about that entire thing is that if you cue a guy to do it and he does it poorly or like crap, then it's not good. Like, it's all about how we move. Whatever you give a player makes no difference, right? If it causes a good movement adaptation, it's good. If it produces a bad one, it's bad. Really simple, right? So the point of that entire thing was to open up, because we see guys feeling better. Like, it's not everybody, but we don't do it with everybody or say force up. Some guys just naturally do it, right? And for some guys, if you're a stiffer mover and they try to do it, they pull slack out real quick, so they decel a little too early. You got to tell them to do it later. Or just tell them to, one of the things that I use a lot is that guys should, elite players allow for thoughts to influence their motor patterns, but they don't force results, right? So like when you look back at Aaron Boone in the 2003 ALCS and Joe Torre tells him, hey, listen, try to get a base hit to right, but that doesn't mean you're not going to hit a home run to left because Wakefield's on the mound, right? And he hits a home run to left to walk it off. Like, he didn't force himself to stay inside the ball to push a ball to the right side, because he's elite. He allows himself to organize to produce a good result, but he doesn't force the result of, fighting to stay inside the ball. So the next segment we're going to go into, so again, playing the video, I'm going to try to keep it short because we got a bunch of stuff to move through still. So this is a kid that came in. This is him at 12 years old. Okay, 12 years old, throwing 80 miles an hour from the left side. So this is at the Little League World Series, or Cooperstown. This is him in high school. He was 88 to 90 his senior year, okay? This is his freshman year at the college. Look at that, October 28th, 2015, okay? So at the end of his freshman year, he was 83 to 85. He went in at 88 to 90, and now he's 83 to 85, okay? That's not good. Last year, he started working with one of our trainers. He was at 88 to 90 as a redshirt sophomore. So it's 3 years later. He spent the last couple of years building the strength back up to be able to be at 88 to 90. But he wasn't really like a guy they were considering using as a major Division I program, right? 88 to 90, like just a strike thrower. Started working on his arm path, right? And 3 months later, he was hitting 97, and he got drafted in the 17th round. And he only threw 9 innings. So actually, I feel super comfortable talking about it now since Paul said that he agreed with it. Paul was talking about weighted balls. Kyle talked about, a lot of people talk about weighted balls. Why do they work? Why do they work? I'm going to give you my opinion on why I think they work and don't work. 3 results happen from a program, weighted ball program, right? 1, best case scenario. Guy gains velo, gets healthier, feels like $1 million, okay? Scenario 2, guy doesn't throw any harder, but he feels better, right? A lot of guys will say they feel better, they just don't have any more juice. They're not throwing harder, okay? Scenario 3, guy gets hurt. In scenario A, the weight of the ball or the drills he was doing or the bowling pins or the PVC pipes or the hammers or screwdriver, whatever, the water bottles, Wasserman's water, whatever he was doing altered his movement pattern in his arm. He worked at a more proximal position on landing and allowed the arm to unwind away from him. Velocity generation in the arm, a lot of it, it has to do with how the arm is and the health. It has to do with how the arm is moving through space, how the body is moving the arm through space. When we throw, we rotate. When the trunk rotates, the arm is going to work behind, and then it's going to unwind because our elbow does 2 things. It flexes and extends, and it pronates and supinates. We work from a flex position at landing, and then we unwind out the chain. We want to allow it to release. But a lot of guys don't do that. When you get a guy to do that, he throws harder and he throws healthier. When a guy doesn't do that, but doesn't have high stress throwing patterns, then he throws healthier, the result doesn't get better. The guy that gets hurt is the guy that throws really poorly in the first place, creates no positive adaptations, and adds load. Like in the weight room, are you going to add load to a guy's movement patterns in a squat if he moves poorly? If he's got a bad squat pattern, are you just going to keep adding load on it and tell him to do it harder and expect it to always get better? Right? You can't. It all has to do with how the individual is moving and whether or not you're creating a better movement adaptation. So these are some of the drill. I mean, we do a ton of stuff. I try anything and everything. We've been doing dynamic warm-up stuff, throwing, turns, jumps, getting athletic, like trying to figure out ways to create different or more optimal length-tension relationships in the body and get the arm to work better. And not all of these are perfect, right? But they're working towards creating better motor patterns to let the ball unwind. Yesterday, do you remember in Paul's presentation when you saw the arm kind of unwind and he talked about the importance of rotational velocity there and getting the forearm to rotate? Good arms are 0 to 13 at the elbow on release and about 90 at the shoulder. Okay, they're out here. What people fail to realize sometimes is that if I'm throwing from it, everybody throws from this slot. We're not even overhead athletes. We release from here. We get here when we land. You could classify us as overhead athletes, but when we throw from a higher slot, we tilt our spine. We're still throwing around our spine. We're just tilting the tornado over. So that doesn't even necessarily make us overhead athletes, does it? It all depends on how you look at it, kind of like the barrel above the hands thing. Okay, so this was a report. We had an organization send us a professional player this offseason, and he was a very high draft pick out of high school, and he did not feel so good this year. This was his second year. He got shut down in the middle of the year, had some arm issues, shoulder impingement, and we did an assessment, and he's training with us this offseason, and we put together a report for them. So this is a really important piece of the report, and this is going to challenge some current views and thinking on how we look at hitting and pitching and training it. We put guys on a table, right? We assess them. And when we do that, we're trying to get an idea and ask somebody, is this guy going to get hurt? Is he going to be able to extend his career? Is he at risk right now? But the person that's actually doing the assessment a lot of times, that person never even watches them move. They don't understand movement patterns in hitting and throwing. They didn't actually watch the person move. They didn't do a throwing assessment, right? But there's these automatic things that we look at. Emily's going to talk about some of those right now.
So something that a lot of people believe is that lacking internal rotation on the back hip of a pitcher is going to set them up for injury. It's a problem. We need to fix it and just crank them into internal rotation. First off, all of the research that correlates internal rotation to either spine or upper extremity injury in a pitcher is not looking at the back hip. It's looking at the front hip. And in any other sport where they're correlating lack of internal rotation in a rotational athlete such as tennis, such as pitching, golf, are either correlating that lack of internal rotation in the front hip with injury, or a lot of these research evidence, if you look at meta-analysis, which is basically taking all of the research in a particular area and then drawing global conclusions based on all the research, not just one research study, it's generally inconclusive.
And deemed as more of a movement issue possibility than a direct correlation, because there's just as many in populations that are healthy with it.
So that's the first thing I would say is look more closely at the research. Are they talking about the front hip or the back hip? And if you look across research, is it actually conclusive? And what meta-analysis will tell you is actually no. So first off, it's not supported really in the research. The second problem with that is that, like Eugene said, I have to rag on my own profession for a little bit here, is that coaches, scouts, teams are always coming to us as the doctors and asking, is this kid healthy? Does he have a good machine behind him? Is he going to get injured? Have we made a good investment? And us as the medical staff, we so badly want to be able to give you guys answers and be able to predict. And so most physical therapists and doctors will give you the only information that they can actually acquire and then make very vast decisions based on that. What physical therapists are really good at doing is measuring range of motion and measuring strength. And the way that they do that, there are some functional tests and measures, but I would even argue that that's still drastically different than what happens on the mound. But generally what medical staff will do is they'll throw a guy on a table and they'll measure hip rotation. And the way that we measure hip rotation is supine, so on your back, they bring the hip up to 90 degrees of flexion, which your back hip is never in that position when you pitch, and then we measure rotation from neutral.
So let's think about when we pitch. Let's think about all those guys you watched earlier that looked effortless. We tell guys we want them to be in their glutes, right? Be in your glutes. Be glute dominant with it, not quad dominant, right? Well, there's two ways I can get to internal rotation or external rotation because it's relative to the positioning of the femur and the pelvis. I can get to internal rotation like this, or I can get there like this. I can get to external rotation like that, or I could get there like that. And the glutes happen to be an external rotator. When you're in the weight room and you're doing squats, what do you do with a guy's feet? Toe out, toe out. So you're working from a max position of external rotation. And then when you do let it go, it's not even internally rotated. It's at neutral. The hips are squared up forward. It's not even internally rotated. So when you focus on pitching or hitting and doing this first, like let's think about it from a hitting perspective. When our front foot lands, the ball is 10 feet in front of us, which means we need efficiency. We have to get to the ball really, really quickly, right? The middle is our mover. Lance talked about it the other day. Zach will tell you the same thing. The middle is the mover. It shoots down, it shoots up, right? If I want the middle to move me, I want to create an anchor point, and I want to get to external rotation so I can use what I have in my glutes. When you watch Vasquez, let's see if this works. I don't know if it's going to work. How many guys, raise your hand, please, if you've ever used the cue in pitching to keep their back foot anchored into the rubber? Raise your hand real quick if you've used that. Why? Does it work? It does, right? You've seen it work before. That's right. Because when you do that and you're turning like this, you're keeping your anchor point. And then the hips turn, this gets let go, and it comes up. Vasquez does it. Severino does it. Tons of guys do it. Do you have to do it to be an elevator? No. But if you want to stay in your glutes longer, you can't force yourself into internal rotation. So all of the guys that are sitting like this hitting and can't hit fastballs, right, because they're stuck in a preloaded position of a joint like that, right? They have no ability to load and unload the area. They're forcing themselves into internal rotation. You can't do that, right? We have to work to external rotation to neutral.
So like Eugene said, one, lack of internal rotation, in my opinion, is invalid because it's not supported by research. Two, the way we test it is not actually where an athlete is internally or externally rotated when they pitch. The third reason is when you pitch, your initial hip pop is actually external rotation. It's not internal rotation. So as your femur is fixed, your pelvis rotates over your femur towards home plate. This is relative external rotation. So the motion that's potentially much, much, much more important on the back hip is external rotation, not internal rotation. Now, as the athlete rolls over that foot and continues their pitching motion, they are internally rotating that hip directionally. So they're moving from a position of external rotation back to neutral. Because you have to remember their pelvis is all the way facing home at this point. So when their femur is internally rotating in the motion, it's not actually reaching a large internal rotation range of motion. So it's directionally internally rotating, but from a position standpoint, they're actually just rotating back to neutral. So lacking internal rotation range of motion should not be a huge red flag for most of our pitchers. And so we make the mistake a lot of times of sticking a pitcher or a batter, like Eugene said, in a position of internal rotation. Now, that's a problem, first off, because if you have a stiff mover, your pelvis and femur are always going to want to move together. So if I internally rotate my hip, that's what we call a closed pack position. So essentially there's less room in the hip joint for anybody if you internally rotate them. So there's less degrees of freedom. Now, as you guys know, there's a huge abduction range of motion that happens in the hip as you stride down the mound. So if I need to reach this big abduction range of motion, but I've already closed off the space in my hip joint, a stiff mover is going to immediately move out of internal rotation, give themselves more space in their hip joint so that they can stride out. So what that looks like realistically is our hips are going to leak forward really quickly to move themselves out of internal rotation. So that looks like opening way too early and leaking forward. So the other problem with that is if you stick a hitter or a pitcher into internal rotation, our muscles like to work at an optimal length tension relationship. So if you shorten a muscle to its max range or you lengthen a muscle to its max range, you're going to get less power or less torque out of that muscle. So if I internally rotate my leg, I'm taking my hip and that glute muscle, which is an extensor and an external rotator, towards its end range of motion, and your glute is actually less powerful in an internally rotated position. So I have less engine behind that leg now to stride down the mound. If I want someone to use their glute optimally, that foot has either got to be neutral or slightly externally rotated. As soon as I move them into internal rotation, I'm basically giving them less ability to use that glute down the mound.
So let's make use of this information. You have a guy that's a tight mover, right? You have a tight mover. You see that he can't throw strikes or he's not maximizing his velo, and you see that he has poor internal rotation. Rather than spending the next 3 months trying to open up his hip so he could, which is going to tighten up anyway over time, like what over the course of the season, like why not just open his foot? Why not just do that? I mean, Scherzer does it. Felix Hernandez does it. Justin Verlander does it. Felix Hernandez starts like this, and then it sweeps open even further as he's going forward. Like, why not just do that? Why not just angle them a little closed? Like, sequencing is more important for our ability to throw healthy and throw strikes than getting to some optimal, I have to stride to that spot. No, you don't. You don't. I'm sorry, you don't. If you are look, every individual has a different body type, different movement profile, different physical capability. We need to work within those capabilities to get guys to move optimally. Some guys land. I was talking to a pitching coach from an organization, this was like 3 months ago, and he was a college pitching coach. And one of his guys, right, he was part of the reason he ended up in pro ball. Like, he turned this dude around. He ended up throwing like fuel, like 98. And when the kid ended up in pro ball, he was told that he's not allowed to land with his foot open like this anymore, okay? And now all of a sudden, 2 years later, kid's velo's down 7 miles an hour, can't throw a freaking strike, never had problem with command before, but you took away his length-tension relationship. We need to get out of our own heads and what we perceive as this is what it has to be and start to allow ourselves to open up our minds to the fact that there's different individuals. And once again, like, everything that every single person in this room has ever said is right. None of you have ever said bad information. It's all good information. We just have to open up our toolboxes and figure out who to apply it to and how and when. Because we have no education. It's not even anybody's fault. There's zero education. Zero. Like, where's our education? How do we learn how to do our jobs? On the job, right? There's no coaching school. Former players, we start coaching and we give people what we heard, what we felt, what we did, right? But that's all we have. So we just have to keep like opening up that window. So with this particular player, we're going to continue with the report that we did. Those were some of the things that we did. So here's his initial testing. So what you're going to see is early trunk rotation, right? The wave in his arm, that is not a clean arm path. That arm is traveling into the anterior shoulder as it's lifting and then kind of pushing over the ball. That's a bad line. If you have a guy that looks like that, that's bad. Okay? Do you want to explain some of the numbers?
Yeah, so up here you have graphs of the torque acting at his shoulder and his elbow as well as his kinematic sequence. So this particular athlete had actually some really red flag numbers in both the torque at his elbow and his shoulder. His elbow torque was almost twice of what we prefer it to be. But there was a problem with Microsoft PowerPoint. I'm just going to keep talking while Eugene fixes this. So
I don't know how to fix it. I just coach baseball players. I don't know how to do this. Can you do it?
His torque levels at his elbow were almost twice what we would consider healthy or safe. And even more notably, the torque levels at his shoulder were more than double as well what we prefer to see in athletes, or in pitchers, I should say. And he actually was having shoulder symptoms. So generally when athletes come in, and they have arm patterning problems, we'll see either high torque at the elbow or high torque at the shoulder. We generally don't see red flags in both joints. So this athlete was how I would categorize a high-risk athlete.
Good. I would just keep rolling.
I can take this off so you can talk without it being a distraction.
Okay.
Sorry.
So Eugene, do you want to talk a little bit about what you did with him, and I'll talk about the results?
Sure. So in terms of altering the pattern, we isolated it first. We did a lot of different things to try to get his arm to capture better. We used internal cueing, external cueing, feels. We used the thought to, this works for some guys, take 3 fingers, close them, thumb and pinky out, and think about scratching the back of your neck with your thumb. We threw bowling pins, we threw PVC pipes, whole bunch of stuff. To try to create a more optimal movement pattern for his arm. Threw a lot of weighted balls, did a lot of different drills, and the arm started to clean up. And when you look at motor learning, how I view it, right or wrong, I look at it like you are isolating a specific pattern of movement, and once you have the pattern, you can challenge it. If you don't have a good pattern, challenging it is worthless. So you learn the pattern, you challenge the pattern, and then if it succeeds, you continue to move forward. If it fails, you go backwards. Sometimes we'll have a guy thrown against the wall, and when he has his eyes open, he can't do it well. When he closes his eyes, it's money. Like money, eyes closed, right? Open his eyes, crappy. And then he figures out how to do it with his eyes open. Then you move him in the cage, and he opens his eyes, and you give him a baseball, garbage. Close his eyes, good. So it's all blending it up. And some guys, we had a kid, I was talking to Justin James from UCSD, who's a brilliant pitching coach, and or he's not with UCSD anymore, he's at Point Loma, but we had a kid this last summer that Dimitri, because he was the pitching coach there at the time, sent up, and he was like 80, I think 85, 86, and he made the least progress of anybody for the first month and a half of the summer. Like, least progress of anybody. And then one day, clicked. Like a light bulb, just figured it out. His second bullpen, he was 88 to 90. Second bullpen. There were other guys who were really good early on, and then as they moved to the mound, struggled a little bit. Different guys have, different issues blending patterns to the mound.
Talk about results afterwards.
Yeah, talk about results.
So we took this athlete, and after how long was it that you worked with him? A couple weeks?
He started in...
I want to say a couple months you had him.
2 months.
Yeah, about 2 months. We came in and we retested him. His elbow torque levels were back down to a normal level. He cut his shoulder torque by 62%. Overall better sequencing throughout the throwing motion, and is pain-free. So this is generally what we see. This is a pattern we see with almost all the 108 athletes that come in. We get them on initial evaluation, and then after working with Eugene and his team for a few months, all of his athletes are cutting their torque down. All of his athletes are improving sequencing, and they're measuring higher velocity, things like that. So what we like to see is that these changes in kinematics and kinetics that are resulting in safer arms and healthier elbows and shoulders are actually resulting in increased performance as well. So the two do go hand in hand really nicely. So we're seeing some very powerful results in that regard.
Where was the pain in that athlete?
Posterior shoulder.
Pain was in the shoulder, didn't present in the elbow, but on the same token, like physically, he is extremely gifted. He's extremely gifted physically. So sometimes we'll see a kid that's like 15 that comes in, and he throws 72, which is awful at that age, right? And he doesn't have pain, okay? He doesn't have pain, but he's also strong enough to deal with how poor the throwing motion is. You know what I mean? So he's strong enough to deal with that level, but if he was to, say, throw that same way at 84, he'd probably have an issue.
And not all torque levels will result in the same response with an athlete. So we talked about 150 or 115 newton meters of torque is we like to see athletes lower than that in their elbow. Some athletes will start to have symptoms at 80 newton meters of torque, and some athletes we've seen upwards of 200 newton meters of torque symptom-free. So your UCL or your common flexor tendon, some of the structures in your elbow that attenuate that torque or are stressed in that throwing motion, you have more than just one structure that is being loaded with that torque. And so some athletes, depending on how they're structured, can tolerate more load than others. So a certain level of torque doesn't always correlate black and white in a 1-to-1 ratio to when you'll feel pain and where you'll feel pain. So depending on how the elbow is structured, depending on their bony morphology, depending on hypertrophy of their common flexor tendon in their elbow, it depends on where you'll see symptoms. So we don't just go off symptoms with an athlete, we go off their numbers as well, because high torque is high torque and we're trying to minimize risk as best we can. So even if they are symptom-free, like this athlete in his elbow, we still want to perform, or we still want to work on their technique to get motor programs that are going to get that torque down as well.
So we're still having some trouble with this, so I guess I'll just explain what we were going to see. Like, his lower half isn't finished yet, and he was still throwing like 88 to 90 the other day. It's still early in the process. Like, I expect that he'll be 93, 94 by the time he goes back, and pain-free. And when he came in, he was 88 to 91, 92 sometimes with arm pain, right? So very successful offseason for him. The slide after that I was going to pull up was a more hitting-related slide, kind of going back to that individual I was talking about earlier. So when you assess a hitter, you have to look at what's actually happening in games. Totally agree. I happen to like the tee. I like to assess off the tee because I feel like that helps me understand what his brain is telling him to do, right? Which translates. If he's working on forcing internal rotation all the time when he's swinging and he loses his length-tension relationship in his backside, and then it doesn't present all the time when he hits in games, but some of the time and a lot more of the time on his failures, I still want to see what he thinks he's supposed to do. I want to see how he thinks he's supposed to move. When we use the data, like when I look at hit tracks data or blast motion, you got to be super careful. You got to be super careful with all that stuff because, look, it's easy to make guys' exit velocity go up. You can have a guy's exit velocity go up, and it creates a negative adaptation for games, right? So he hits the ball harder off of hit tracks in a cage, but then you go out to games, and the result is not quite as good. So when we work with pro guys, it's not as much on, again, it's dependent on the individual, but it's not as much on like exit velocities. Like, we don't really care. We just want to see him move better, like specific movements. So with that particular hitter, he naturally had a little bit of kickback in his swing, but he was landing open because he was reading a book on hitting, and he was seeing that guys should land with the front foot open, and that made sense to him. But he also has an extreme degree of internal rotation, 64 degrees or something like 65 degrees of internal rotation on his lead side, which means he couldn't get to that means he could go like all the way over here. Right, so he can never block off his energy. So a big focus was closing his front foot off, giving him a little bit of angle to brace him better. Another big part of the focus was to give him better posture, right? Because he was landing open but tall, no posture, right? So what do you think he hit? Not hard to figure out. Inside fastballs really well, right? And then everything outside breaking away from him, like no adjustability. So when you look at him from the following year, considerably better adjustability, very good results.
So this is the after video for the same athlete we were talking about after his post-evaluation. So what you'll see is overall better sequencing. He's not rotating all of his pelvis, torso, and arm together, so he actually gets some better connection there. And then his torque graph is significantly lower. Like I said, almost a 62% decrease. And what you would have noticed in the graph before, where there were two moments of high torque at the elbow throughout his pitching motion. He now only has one moment of high torque, which is right where we'd expect it to be, and it's much, much, much lower than it was before. The PowerPoint's up there, it's just the video.
Oh, just the video. Okay.
Just close it out.
Yeah. So the last slide that we were going to pull up basically said everything works and everything sucks. Okay, like everything works. There's nothing that you can't do that doesn't work. You just have to figure out, like I said earlier, who to use it for, who to use it with, and when to use it, right? And there are so many things for us to still continue to figure out. Like, coaches have to learn how to, like a college coach is not necessarily like a scientist that's just going to sit around and collect a whole bunch of data all the time. Your job is to make your players better. How can I use the data right now to make my players better? That's what you're interested in, winning games, making guys better. That's your job, right? You have to learn how to understand the information because in this game right now, the dangerous part is like kids and young players not listening to go. You might have the exact right thing to tell him, but he's not going to listen to anything you have to say because you don't understand his world, right? You don't understand the world he's living in, the viewpoint through which he sees, the lens through which he sees. So he's never going to listen. Like if you tell him slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and he actually did it, like he might throw 4 miles an hour harder and get drafted. But he's not going to listen to you. So we have to continue to push the game forward, but we also have to get better at using empirical observations to test and actually like understand what's actually going on, right? Like it's not old school, new school. It's not over here, and it's not over here. It's right in here, okay? And this room in particular, there is not one person that came all the way out here that's not good at their job. Everybody here loves to do this. Like I heard somebody at the ABCA a couple of years ago say, if you coach baseball and you're trying to make money, you're retarded. Like, it's true, right? We do this because we love it. So everybody here, this is the best in the game. That's why, Lance is such an amazing human for putting it on, and, all of you guys are here trying to push the game forward. So thanks so much for listening to the presentation. I cherish the opportunity. It's a huge honor. Thank you so much.